Recently, we've been looking into the evils of the mass fusion company. I did a video on the mass fusion building and company, then I did a video on the mass fusion containment shed, and there, we got the impression that mass fusion was dumping toxic nuclear waste into a nearby lake. Let's follow up on this to see if it's true. The first place we need to go to is the Nahant Oceanological Society. The Nahant Oceanological Society rests on the easternmost tip of the Nahant Peninsula. The complex is comprised of two buildings, one administrative office where employees would work, and one laboratory. Let's explore the office building first. Upon entering the first room, we are relieved. No skeletons, no super mutants, no raiders, no gore, no blood bags. It just looks wrecked and normal, thank God.
A whale's eyeballs are fixed. To look in a different direction, it must turn its whole body.
Wait, I think I was too quick to say normal. What was that? Maybe the nearby research terminal can tell us. The user of this terminal was a man named Jim Prescott. The first note is an internal memo to society members. This letter is from a man called Dr. Casey Reed, who is apparently the director of this entire society. We learned that the bulk of the society staff will be in Monterey for the National Aquatic Protection Symposium. Dr. Casey alone will be remaining here at the Nahant Oceanological Society because he and his society are preparing a harbor blockade to protest the war. In the first week of November, he and his staff are working to get volunteers who will participate in this blockade protest against the war. He ends by saying that he'll be working out of the research lab, and then he tells Jim, the owner of this terminal, to make sure to shut down the robots before he leaves for the weekend. Well, it appears that Jim forgot to do that because that first voice we heard upon entry must have been one of the robots. And this explains why we haven't found any skeletons in this main lobby. All of the staff was away in Monterey. The second note on the terminal says goals. Here we learn the entire purpose of the Nahant Oceanological Society. Number 1, to save our oceans by researching the long-term effects of radioactive exposure on aquatic life. And number 2, working with the community to raise public awareness. They believe that companies, and they specifically name Poseidon Energy and General Atomics, are responsible for harming the oceans, and this society believes that radical action is necessary to protect the world from a horrific future. Well, we all know that he is right, but a harbor blockade was hardly radical enough to prevent the apocalypse. Through the doors and into the next room, we find ourselves in a kind of hallway with a couple of doors on the left-hand side and a stairway going up. The first door on the left is a bathroom with a first aid kit on the wall. The second door leads to a kitchen. Not much in here, but a Vault-Tec lunchbox where I found yet another Sentry Bomb model. Gosh, I'm getting way too many of these things. And then a cooler on the table in the middle of the kitchen. At last, we finally meet our oceanological instructor.
A single mouthful of seawater may contain hundreds of thousands of phytoplankton.
After that, he stopped spouting off all of those scientific facts, which I really liked. So I used Bethesda's archive extractor to find the sound files recorded for these robots. Here's what all of their scientific facts sound like.
When threatened, the pufferfish will blow itself up to more than twice its original size to scare off predators. Some species of hermit crabs can live up to 70 years and grow to the size of a coconut. The bite of a great white shark can exceed 40,000 pounds per square inch. A swordfish will use its bill to lash out and stun prey and possess a special organ to heat their brain and eyes. Belcher's sea snake is the most venomous snake in the world. A few milligrams of venom is enough to kill hundreds of people. Members of the Scorpenidae family, such as the lionfish, possess a sharp dorsal spine coated in a venomous mucus. Certain species of catfish are equipped with spines long enough to pierce a human heart or lungs. When bifurcated, some starfish can regenerate into two separate starfish. Lobsters have blue blood.
Heading through the doors into the next room, we find what looks like an employee work area. There are a whole bunch of tables set out with blown-out terminals. This is probably where the society members worked hard to combat the actions of the evil corporations. There's a door leading out, which we'll go through in a moment. And then on top of the far left desk against the north wall, we find a copy of the Wasteland Survival Guide, Commonwealth Coupon Spectacular. Permanently gain 10% discount from food and drink vendors. All right, we're going to be rolling in the Blamco mac and cheese. Heading upstairs, we find another office space. There's a bottle of bourbon underneath one of the desks, and X688 does not seem impressed by the knowledge of all of these robots.
I've heard all of these facts a dozen times, at least.
Many of the companions in the game have something unique to say upon listening to these chatterbox robots spouting off all of their scientific knowledge. Curie actually says that they're incorrect. In the back of the room, we find a broken door. Looks like the room beyond has collapsed, but if you hop on top of the filing cabinet and look into the left of the door, you find a first aid kit snugly concealed behind the wall. Just some normal random loot that we typically find in first aid kits. The locked door against the eastern wall leads to Dr. Casey's office. If you don't have good lockpicking, you can find a key to this door by heading outside and exploring the wrecked ship next to the dock. Inside that ship, we find a toolbox that has a key labeled Casey's Key. This key opens up the door to Casey's office. Alternatively, there's a giant hole in the floor, so you can bypass the door altogether if you have a jetpack. Just hop on up from the bottom to loot the place. Here we find a red steamer trunk with lots of useful loot. Above it, on a dresser, is a duffel bag with some ammunition inside, and the only other item of note is the wall safe behind Casey's desk. Heading downstairs and going out the back door leads us to a dock with a small little shack on the end. But as soon as we step forward, we hear a noise. That is the unmistakable sound of mirelurks. We are right by the water, ladies and gentlemen. What have we awoken? Well, this is actually a really fun battle. You get swarmed by a slew of mirelurks. It seems that every time I killed one, another one popped up. And if you explore the beach just outside this building, you find 6 or 7 different mirelurk nests. The mirelurks spawn from underneath the dock, and they even come from far out to sea just to attack you. You can walk away with dozens of mirelurk eggs and dozens of pieces of mirelurk meat. This is going to give you an incredible amount of experience if you cook all of this at a cooking station. They just kept coming, ladies and gentlemen. Mirelurk after mirelurk after mirelurk, and they were all leveled as well, which was quite a fun challenge. Once all the mirelurks are dead, and once all the eggs are looted, and once you've gotten Casey's key from the boat, you can hop back up on top of the dock and unlock the red door to the tiny shack. Inside, we find typical loot. One piece of jet on one of the shelves, an ammo box with some ammunition, and that's about it. All we have left to explore is the research lab. Those mirelurk hatchlings are insane. They followed me all over the place. I typically leave them alone because I don't want to waste ammunition on them. I trust my companion to get rid of them. But in this case, they followed me all the way to the parking lot, and then X688 accidentally blew up a car, which knocked out all of the hatchlings. The top floor to the main office building was blown out. This was the wrecked room that was on the other side of that door that had the secret first aid kit. If you have a jetpack, you can hop on up here and explore what's in this room, but it's not a lot, just some randomized loot in a couple of the containers and desks. To the right of the research lab looks like a giant fish tank surrounded by a catwalk of some sort. The water has mostly evaporated away. It looks like there are a few dead fish inside. And then there's a ladder that leads to the roof, which doesn't have anything interesting on top of it. There's a crane on the southeastern corner of the roof. This tells us that they were catching fish or catching something and then testing whatever they caught inside this research lab. Entering the research lab, we appear on the top floor of a larger installation. A mirelurk from downstairs pops up and begins to attack. In all the excitement, I got confused and attacked one of the Oceanological instructor robots by accident. Whoops. On the top floor is another red trunk with some end-of-dungeon loot, right next to a chemistry station. At the far end of the catwalk, we find an ammo crate lying on a table next to a machete and some fish bones. Looks like they were using a machete to dissect fish. And then X688 says something really strange.
Strange. Why smash the tanks?
Why smash the tanks? What tanks? What's he talking about? Well, I saw some red oxygen tanks down there. Is that what he meant? Heading on down, we see a big tank to the left. This could be a fuel tank or maybe a big reservoir of water. There's a big red tank out on the table, but I don't see anything trying to smash it. Next to the stairs against the eastern wall, we find a terminal. This is the research terminal. It belongs to Casey Reed. The first item of the research logs is lobster growth. Dr. Reed tells us that the average mass of crabs has grown by 14% and of lobsters by 12%. This is troublesome because he worries that if the shellfish get too large, they will run out of food necessary to sustain their own population, and the crab and lobster colonies could collapse. Dr. Casey tried to bring this to the press, but the press spun it as a good thing. They wrote articles talking about how wonderful it is to catch such large lobsters and crabs. No one seems to be worried by this. From this entry, we learned two really important things about the Fallout universe. The first is that mirelurks come from either lobster or crabs. We know this because they said that they had samples that they were storing in the lab. They were comparing fresh lobster and fresh crab to crab that they had caught previously, which may be what they were storing in one of these tanks. That's how they were able to compare new lobster growth to the growth of lobsters from a long time ago. This may be why we got attacked by a mirelurk when we entered the lab. Perhaps we got attacked by one of the control specimen's offspring. And the second thing is that lobsters and crabs started to mutate before the bombs dropped. They started to mutate to turn into mirelurks before the nuclear apocalypse. This is the only way we can explain the significant growth that Dr. Casey noticed in lobsters and crabs that they fished out of the Boston harbor before the bombs dropped. Now, it could be that these mutations were due to local environmental effects. Maybe something was happening in the water of Boston that was causing only Boston lobster and Boston crabs to grow so large. It could be that these effects were not measured in crabs and lobster outside of Boston. If I had to bet, I would say that mirelurks evolved from crabs and mirelurk kings evolved from lobsters, simply based on the models that they use in the game. Although the name king makes me think that it's a male and that it may look so different from other mirelurks just due to its gender. So a lot of room for speculation there. The next article, Increased Toxicity, tells us that for 14 months in a row, Casey and the Society has measured an increase in toxicity in barnacles and cod. This equals a month-over-month increase of 34% compared to those in the control tanks. They tried to contact the Boston Port Authority, but the authority refuses to take their calls. So the previous note talks a little bit about how mirelurks might have come to be, and this one helps explain how barnacles became as poisonous as they are. Barnacles being those natural traps that can blast radioactive pus and mucus at you. The final note is samples from Lake Quannapowitt. One of Casey's colleagues sent him a sample from Lake Quannapowitt asking for independent verification to confirm his findings. Casey found that the radiation and toxicity levels are 15 times higher at Lake Quannapowitt than the sample that he got from the same lake last year, and they're well over the safe levels for people to be swimming in that lake. This is interesting, and this is why we came here. We were looking for evidence that mass fusion was dumping toxic waste into Lake Quannapowitt, and this seems to tell us that it might be true. Yes, due to the nuclear apocalypse, every body of water is irradiated, but remember, this terminal entry was made before the bombs dropped. He may have seen radiation levels rising, but this lake alone had a toxicity level in 2077 15 times higher than that of 2076. That is some pretty damning evidence against the Mass Fusion Company. The other note off his keys simply tells us that Casey's key was inside the toolbox in his boat. You can unlock the wall safe on the right to get some more loot, and then heading around the steps to the eastern wall, we find a little workstation with some trays set out. There's a first aid kit on the wall, but you know what we haven't found yet? We haven't found Casey's skeleton. Remember, his note to Jim said that he was going to be working in the lab while everyone else was out at Monterey, and yet we don't find his skeleton inside the lab, nor do we find it on his ship. We also have to figure out what X688 meant. Why smash the tanks? It was then that I noticed a yellow machine lying against the wall. On the machine was one of those red oxygen or fuel tanks, and the machine itself kind of looks like a hydraulic press. There's a giant arm sticking out of it with a chisel on the end, which looks like it's meant to puncture something, but the tank is lying beneath the hammer end of what looks like a giant press. Is this what X688 was talking about? Did he think that Dr. Casey was smashing these tanks with a hydraulic press? If that's the case, I'm with X688. Why smash the tanks? What experiment was he trying to do by smashing these giant tanks? The only thing that I can think of is maybe these are oxygen tanks, and he was using the hydraulic press to measure air pressure or something like that. Maybe he wanted to see what the resistance of one of these tanks was like when subjected to pressure. Maybe these were oxygen tanks that he and his crew were using to scuba dive, or to dive looking for evidence that they could use against corporations. Maybe this was just a home-built test that they were rigging up to make sure that the tanks wouldn't explode or implode under too much pressure, too much ocean pressure. Now, all of these tanks are indeed filled with a flammable gas. You can shoot them and they do explode, but I don't see any indication on the tanks themselves that tell us what kind of gas was inside. But maybe this is much more nefarious. Remember, in Jim's terminal, we learn that they want radical action taking against whom they think are the great evil corporations that are harming the world, Poseidon Energy and Robco. Interesting that they still patronize Robco. They've got robots wandering all over the place. They think Robco is evil, but not so evil that they're not going to buy robots from them. And it's interesting that they don't list mass fusion. Had mass fusion really been flying under the radar this entire time? We learned from the video that I did on mass fusion that the company was a little bit newer, founded by a former Poseidon Energy scientist, important really locally. He was successful in Boston, getting many of the local homes powered by his nuclear reactor. Maybe because mass fusion was an important company locally only, that Casey and his society didn't really count them as being the culprits. But of course they are. They are the ones who are dumping directly into Lake Quannapowitt. Maybe these canisters were part of some sort of sabotage that Casey was planning. Maybe he was testing to see exactly at what pressure it would take before the canister cracked or exploded, so that he could strap them to an underwater oil pipe from Poseidon Energy and blow it up or something. This is where we start to conjecture. We don't really have any solid evidence. The rest of the research lab is unremarkable. We find 2 ammo crates, 1 toolbox, and a power armor repair station. I walk away from this still perplexed about X688 and his comment about smashing the canisters. There's got to be a better method for testing air pressure in a canister besides compressing it with a hydraulic press. Is my theory right? Were they measuring internal gases, or were they using them as some sort of sabotage against Poseidon Energy and General Atomics? Let me know in the comment section below. I would love to read your comments on this topic, because more minds put together on one single task are more likely to come to the more correct answer. We have not finished exploring the sins of mass fusion. I'm going to be doing a video on Lake Quannapowitt itself, and boy, it will be a doozy, so stay tuned for that. Be sure to subscribe if you want to be notified when I publish that video. And if you'd like to chat about this topic with the Oxhorn community on our Discord server, be sure to click that Discord invitation link in the description below. And if you like what I do and you want to support me in a more personal way, consider becoming one of my patrons on Patreon. Patreon subscribers gain access to a private channel on my Discord server, as well as a bunch of other cool Oxhorn perks. But more than anything, ladies and gentlemen, I'm just so glad that you're here watching this video with me today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you bright and early tomorrow morning with a brand new video.